Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, I'll show you how to use the grid system inside Bootstrap. And this is a great system. It's mobile first, which means it starts off as a fluid grid system with each column stacking on top of one another. And then as the viewport size increases, it will scale up to 12 columns. So using the grid is actually very simple. First, you must start with a div class container. And inside this one, you're going to put your rows and your columns. Next, these columns must be wrapped in a row element. And this will ensure they have proper padding, they clear some floats, and so on. So you would do div with a class of row. Now, depending on the content or depending on the layout you need for your page, you will use a certain number of columns for each section. So let's say I want to divide my page in two areas. Well, I would do col-lg-6 times 2. So now I have two divs with a class of col-lg-6. So col-lg-6, I'm just going to put here, and col-lg-6. Now I'm just going to refresh this. And notice my content is divided in two. Now I added this dark background so you can actually see the columns, but in reality, the grid doesn't have any background. You can add that yourself if you want. What about, let's change this. And let's call this first and second. So let's say I want a smaller first section, like 2 columns, and then 10 for the second area. Refresh, and notice now this first is smaller and the second one is bigger. And notice everything I do basically adds up to 12 columns. So I can do stuff like this, 6 here, and I'm going to do col-lg-4. And this will be third. So now I have a section which spans 2 grid columns, and then a second one which spans 6 grid columns, and a third one which spans the remaining 4. And if I change this to 2, we get an incomplete row, right? There is room for 2 more columns here on the right. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how this grid works. Now this grid, let's actually revert back to 4 here. This grid has like a fixed width, and that width is given by the container class. Now I can change this to a fluid grid by adding -fluid to the container class. So now it spans the entire width of my page and it resizes accordingly, as you can see here. So that's how you create basically a fluid grid system. And the rule is the same. You must use a certain number of columns that add up to 12. Now, another cool thing about the grid system is that you can offset columns, meaning, let me give you an example. Let's revert back to a normal grid here. So a fixed grid. And I'm going to add another row. And then I'm going to say col-lg. Let's do col-lg2. Let's say test offset. Let's see it. Okay. And now let's say I want to move this like 2 grid columns to the right. So I would say col-lg offset and the number of columns, which is 2. Refresh. And now this is moved to the right by 2 columns. I can even do offset 10, and that's going to move it all the way to the right. Now, if I add another div here with a col-lg10, for example, and I refresh, notice we have a bit of a problem because now the width is no longer 12 columns, but I have 2 here, 2 from the offset, and 10 from this, so it's 14. But if I do 8 columns here, then I'm going to have 12 in total. So my layout will not be broken. So you must consider this when offsetting columns. Another thing you can do with grids is nesting, which means inside a column, you can put another row. So for example, let's do another row here, and let's say call LG 6 times 2. I'm going to call this level 1 on both of these. Let's refresh. And now inside the first one, I'm going to add another row with call LG 4 plus call LG 8. And don't forget to put the dot sign here. Okay, so this will be level 2 and level 2. Refresh, and there it is. The nested row only spans half the width of my page because it's nested inside this call LG6. And the rule is the same. Whatever you do in the nested row, you must add up 12 columns. So you can do combinations like 3, 9, it doesn't matter, as long as it adds up to 12. Now, that's basically how you use the grid. And notice I'm using the following notation: call dash LG dash the number of columns. Now call, of course, this is the normal, this is how you're telling Bootstrap you want to represent grid columns. The 2 is the number of columns. But the LG actually stands for the viewport size you want to create those columns for. So in my case, LG stands for large desktops. And because the grid system is responsive, it has various styles for different viewport sizes. It has one for medium-sized devices, it has one for small devices, like tablets, and it has one for extra small tablets, like extra small sizes, like smartphones. So let me give you an example. If I bring up the inspector here so you can see the viewport size, look on the top right corner here. As I resize my page, notice at 1200 pixels there is a change. See? Now at 1200 pixels this is called a breakpoint. And at this breakpoint the widths of the grid elements change basically. And if I take a look now, all of my columns are stacking on top of one another. And I can rectify that. Let's say that on this particular viewport size, I want my columns to be just like they were on the bigger size. So I would go here and I would say call MD for medium 2. And that means on a medium-sized screen, use 2 grid columns. Just like this, on a large size screen, use 2 columns. Call MD 6 and call MD 4. So now if I refresh, my first row will be just like before. Oops. See? Okay, now you don't necessarily need to use the exact same number of columns. For example, on the medium size, maybe I want the first column to be 6, the second one 2, and the third one 4. So notice we have different sizes for them. But here's the thing, if you're going to use the exact same number of columns, then the bigger size is not necessary. So I can delete this one, and I can delete these other 2. Right? So this means that on medium and large size desktops, I'm going to use this column configuration. The same goes for if I do XS here, and XS here and here. It means on extra small, small, medium, and large, use this column configuration. So I hope that makes sense. And this is a really great system because it allows you to create various layouts depending on which device you're viewing your website on. So if it's a mobile device, you might want to stack all of these rows, all of these columns, excuse me. On a tablet, for example, you might want to have a 6 by 6 configuration. So 6 columns on the left, 6 columns on the right. And maybe on a large desktop, you might want to split your content into 3 areas instead of 2. It's really up to you. It's really up to the content you're creating. So with these changes, if I refresh my page and start resizing, notice that on all screen sizes, these will stay the same, right? They will not stack. Instead, they will stay on 3 separate areas. Okay, cool. Well, that's basically it for the grid system. This is a really powerful component. There are more things you can do with it, like pulling and pushing columns, which basically means reordering them. But you can read about that on the Bootstrap website on the documentation. Now, in the next lesson, I'll talk about some common elements that you would use in virtually any web page, buttons and icons.